The Detroit Lions may have quietly made one of the smartest moves of the entire offseason, and the more you really look at what Brad Holmes is building, the more obvious it becomes that this roster is evolving right in front of everyone. What stands out the most is not just talent anymore, it is age, depth, balance, and the fact that Detroit may now have the strongest trenches they have had since this entire rebuild started. That is not fan hype either. That is directly connected to what Brad Holmes himself just revealed when he said, "This is probably the deepest the Lions have been on both sides of the line of scrimmage." And honestly, when you start breaking down the roster move by move, it is hard not to understand why he feels that way. Look at the offensive line first, because this might be the biggest transformation that nobody outside Detroit is fully talking about yet. The Lions moved on from Graham Glasgow at 33 years old and Taylor Decker at 32 years old. Those are experienced veterans who meant a lot to this franchise, but this is the NFL. Teams do not stay elite by getting sentimental. They stay elite by refreshing the roster before decline becomes a problem. And what did Detroit do? They got younger immediately. Cade Mays comes in at 27 years old. Blake Miller arrives as a first-round pick at just 22, and suddenly the entire line feels refreshed without sacrificing talent. That is the part that should excite Lions fans the most. This was not a desperate rebuild move. This was a calculated reload. The Lions are not tearing down the offensive line. They are trying to extend the window for another 5 years. And when you already have someone like Penei Sewell anchoring everything, it changes the entire equation. He is the type of player who elevates everyone around him. Detroit understands that. Brad Holmes understands that. And now the depth behind the starters finally looks real too. At one point, people were wondering if Juice Scruggs was going to have to become a major starter immediately, and there were real questions about whether that would be too much pressure. But now the situation looks completely different. Instead of forcing him into a massive role, he can become an important depth piece, and that changes everything about the flexibility of this roster. Ben Bartch becomes another depth option as well, and suddenly Detroit has something contenders absolutely need during a long NFL season: protection against injuries, because last season showed exactly what happens when injuries hit everywhere at once. Depth becomes the difference between surviving and collapsing. Brad Holmes clearly learned from that, and honestly, the scary part for the rest of the NFC is that this offensive line might still improve from here, because younger players usually get better together over time. Now, defensively, this is where things get really interesting because there are still some questions, but there is also a very clear strategy happening. Detroit got younger on the edge too. They moved on from Al-Quadin Muhammad, who was 31, and Marcus Davenport, who was 29, and now the expectation shifts toward younger legs and higher upside players. DJ Wonnum steps into a bigger role, while Derek Moore becomes one of the most fascinating names on this defense because Detroit clearly believes he can bring real energy and explosiveness to the rotation, but the biggest conversation here has to be the interior defensive line. Losing DJ Reader is not something fans should completely ignore. There was a point where he felt incredibly important to the identity of the defense. Even if his impact cooled off later, he was still a reliable presence. Then there is Roy Lopez, who quietly became one of those players fans appreciated more every week. Maybe the stats did not always jump off the screen, but sometimes you simply notice certain players when they are on the field. Roy Lopez had that effect, and another team clearly valued him enough to double his pay. So now the pressure shifts to the younger players. Tyleik Williams suddenly becomes one of the most important development stories on this entire defense. Detroit needs that year 1 to year 2 jump. They need disruption. They need consistency. They need somebody inside who can become a long-term force next to Alim McNeill. And speaking of McNeill, the expectations for him are massive too, because if he returns to dominant form, the entire front changes. But let's be honest here, everything defensively still revolves around Aiden Hutchinson. And the good news for Detroit is that there is absolutely no reason to doubt him right now. He is still only 25 years old, fully healthy again, under contract, and already viewed as one of the faces of the franchise. That is the type of player every team dreams about building around. The Lions are expecting superstar production from him this season, and based on everything we have seen, there is no reason to think he cannot deliver exactly that. What makes all of this even more fascinating is that Detroit may not even be done adding to the defensive line. There are still experienced pass rushers available, and that creates another layer of intrigue around what Brad Holmes could still do. Even a cheaper veteran addition could completely change the rotation and give Detroit even more flexibility. That is what contenders do. They never stop looking for one more piece. And then there is another detail that cannot be ignored: turnovers. Detroit finished with a +4 turnover differential, and honestly, that number has to improve if this team wants to take another leap. The Lions had only 13 interceptions and 6 fumble recoveries while turning the ball over 15 times themselves. Compare that to teams that lived off takeaways last season, and you can immediately see where Detroit still has room to grow. The encouraging part is that turnover numbers can swing dramatically from year to year. Sometimes it is about pressure, sometimes it is luck, sometimes it is simply opportunities. Which brings us to one of the most interesting conversations surrounding this team right now. Who is actually the biggest star on the Detroit Lions? That question says a lot about how far this franchise has come, because there are legitimately multiple answers now. You could argue for Jared Goff, simply because quarterbacks naturally become the face of a team. You could argue for Jahmyr Gibbs because of how explosive and electric he is every time he touches the football. You could argue for Hutchinson because of his personality and defensive dominance. You could even argue for Sewell because of how valuable he is to everything Detroit does offensively. But there is one name that keeps standing out more than anyone else right now, and that is Amon-Ra St. Brown. The production is elite, the personality connects with fans, the celebrations keep him visible, and even during the offseason, he stays relevant through interviews, appearances, and his podcast presence. He feels like the emotional heartbeat of this era of Lions football. And honestly, maybe that is the best sign of all for Detroit. This team no longer has just one recognizable player carrying the spotlight. It has multiple stars, multiple leaders, and a roster that suddenly feels deeper and younger at the exact same time. But now the real question becomes this: if Brad Holmes is right about these trenches being the deepest they have ever been, could this finally be the version of the Lions roster that is built to survive an entire season and make a true championship run? What do you think about it? What makes this entire situation even more exciting for Lions fans is that the deeper you look into the roster, the more you start realizing this front office is planning far beyond just one season. Brad Holmes is not building a team that only looks dangerous on paper in May. He is trying to create a roster that can survive December, January, and eventually the pressure that comes with playoff football. That is the real difference between a good team and a legitimate contender in the NFL. And when you really think about it, the Lions may finally have something they did not fully have in previous years: internal competition everywhere. That matters more than people realize. The reason elite teams stay dangerous is because players cannot relax. Every position group is pushing each other constantly, and Detroit is starting to look exactly like that kind of environment. Take the offensive line again, for example. Even with the changes, there is still confidence surrounding the group because the system itself has become stable. That is one of the biggest accomplishments of this coaching staff. The Lions are no longer depending on one single veteran to hold everything together. They have created continuity. Younger players are stepping into a structure that already works, and that gives Detroit a huge advantage compared to teams trying to rebuild entire units from scratch. And honestly, the Blake Miller addition feels bigger every time you think about it. First-round offensive linemen are not drafted just to sit quietly forever. The Lions clearly believe he can become a major long-term piece. What makes it even more important is that Detroit is trying to stay ahead of aging before it becomes a crisis. Too many teams wait too long to refresh the trenches and suddenly collapse when older players decline at the same time. Brad Holmes is trying to prevent that scenario entirely. Then defensively, there is still this feeling that another leap could happen if the young talent develops quickly enough. Because the Lions are not asking everybody to become a superstar overnight. They simply need complementary growth around the established core. If Derek Moore becomes a reliable rotational edge player, that matters. If Tyleik Williams becomes more disruptive inside, that matters. If Aleem McNeil dominates consistently again, suddenly offenses cannot focus all their attention on Aiden Hutchinson anymore. And that is the key. Everything becomes easier when Hutchinson is getting help. Last season, there were stretches where it felt like offenses knew exactly where the pressure was coming from. That cannot happen consistently if Detroit wants to compete with the elite teams. The Lions need multiple pass rush threats, even if some of them are rotational players. That is why the possibility of adding another veteran edge rusher still feels very real. Not necessarily a blockbuster move, but the type of signing that quietly strengthens the rotation before the season begins. The interesting names being discussed all come with different risks. Hassan Reddick obviously has production behind his name. Multiple double-digit sack seasons do not happen by accident. Joey Bosa still flashes game-changing ability when healthy, even if injuries have followed him throughout his career. Then there are lower-profile players who may not dominate headlines, but could fit perfectly into Detroit's system as situational contributors. And honestly, that is where Brad Holmes has earned trust from this fan base. Lions fans are no longer reacting with panic every time a big-name player leaves or every time Detroit avoids a flashy move. The reason is simple. This front office has already proven it can identify value where other teams are not looking. That confidence did not exist years ago. It exists now because Holmes has consistently found players who fit the culture, fit the locker room, and fit the system Dan Campbell wants to build. You can see it all over the roster. Tough players, competitive players, players willing to embrace physical football. Detroit has an identity now, and that identity starts in the trenches. But there is still one area where this team absolutely must improve if they want to reach another level, and that is creating takeaways defensively. The turnover conversation is bigger than people think because it completely changes games. Extra possessions win playoff matchups. Momentum swings win division battles. And last season, Detroit simply did not generate enough of those game-changing moments consistently. The encouraging part is that improvement there feels realistic. A healthier defensive line alone could increase pressure dramatically, and pressure creates mistakes. Hutchinson healthy for a full season changes things. Better depth changes things. More disruption inside changes things. Suddenly quarterbacks are throwing earlier than they want to. Suddenly defensive backs get more opportunities. And if that happens, this team becomes even more dangerous because offensively, the Lions already know they can score with almost anybody. That brings the conversation right back to the star power on this roster because Detroit is entering a strange but exciting phase where multiple players genuinely feel nationally recognizable now. Amon-Ra St. Brown continues to feel like the emotional center of the offense because of his consistency, confidence, and personality. Jared Goff remains the steady leader at quarterback, even if he does not have the flashy image of some other superstar quarterbacks around the league. Jahmyr Gibbs has become one of the most explosive weapons in football every time he touches the ball, and Hutchinson